thanks to everybody here for inviting us for this panel. I'm going to quickly introduce my fellow panelists here, get into some questions, and then if anybody has some at the end, we're happy to take questions from the audience as well. So to my immediate left here is Ben Freeman, who I've worked with in the past when I was back at The Intercept. He's one of the foremost, or one of the original kind of analysts of and students of foreign influence here in Washington, D.C. He's now the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute. He's the author of The Foreign Policy Auction, the first book to systematically analyze the foreign influence industry in the United States. Before the Quincy Institute, he founded the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy. His work has appeared everywhere, and he's appeared everywhere. Thank you for joining us here. Sarah Leah Whitson, I'm sure who many of you know here, is the executive director of Dawn. She has a book coming out next year. Bookmark that. The name of the book is?
Blueprint.
The Blueprint. You're going to love it. She described it a little bit. It's going to be great. Kombiz Lavasany over here, long-time progressive, kind of democratic operative, American Federation of Teachers, previously with Howard Dean's DNC, the last time the DNC was cool, maybe?
Only time the DNC.
Is that right?
Cool.
The only time?
I don't go that far back, but yeah, you know.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. And then Lily Greenberg Call, who was, as some of you may remember, she was the first Biden Jewish political appointee to resign in protest of the genocide in Gaza. She's had a decade plus of work in politics as well. Lily, thank you so much. Very much appreciate it. So Ben, I wanted to start with a piece of legislation that is going to the House floor tonight. And it will be voted under suspension, which means it needs 2/3 of the chamber to vote yes for it to pass. It is unlikely that Chuck Schumer is going to take it up in the Senate before the lame duck ends. It is almost certain that the next Congress will take it up and pass it at some point. This is legislation that would strip the 501c3 status of any organization that the Treasury Secretary determines of his own, like he can just make it up, of quote unquote supporting terrorism. How does this, where does this fit into what we understand about Project Esther and Project 2025? And how does it also fit into the rubric of the way that different sides are weaponizing foreign influence laws?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think this current bill fits into a long line of foreign influence bills, just like, I apologize to everybody, I'm nursing a sore throat, so bear with me, please. But this fits into this long line of foreign influence bills that go after the quote unquote bad guys. What's a bad guy? You know it when you see it. Is that what it is? But what it ends up being is the weaponization of foreign influence, whether it's the weaponization of transparency of foreign influence issues, or in this case, it's the weaponization of a tax status. What this bill would effectively allow the government to do, to say who can and cannot be a nonprofit. And as I think many of the folks in this room and online who either work at or donate to nonprofits, a lot of benefits come with that. And so the potential, the sort of fear and the climate that could create could be incredibly toxic for anybody who might even just want to talk to a regime that's out of favor, or even engage in basic acts of diplomacy. You want to have a track 2 dialogue with the country who's not in vogue. Potentially this bill could mean you could jeopardize your nonprofit status just by doing that. And the reason I say this is not the first time we've seen this. We've seen this with many other bills that are, foreign influence laws, whether it's about, foreign funding of think tanks, or whether it's about reforms to the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. We've seen and reform initiatives for all those things, specifically targeted to just a list of the U.S.'s, so-called enemies. Unfortunately, foreign influence doesn't really see those boundaries. When it comes to foreign influence in the U.S., whether it's a so-called friend or it's a so-called enemy. This election, it certainly didn't matter. Where that money was coming from, and so folks like me and others, I think we're very concerned about these because these are not really bills designed to better insulate the U.S. against malign foreign influence. They're bills that are really designed to punish specific countries and could potentially be a huge stifler of free speech in the U.S.
Yes, Sarah, what do you make of this? The fact that they're moving so quickly after the election on this, and what would be the effect of it if it actually does go into law?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand the genesis of this bill and the notion that the IRS will have the power to shut down nonprofit organizations deemed to support terrorism outside of any legal or statutory definition of supporting terrorism. It is pinpoint really designed to silence criticism of Israel. That is what this is about, and it is a very direct energized response to the American public and the American people and the mass expression of criticism of Israel for its genocidal atrocities in Gaza. And the fact that there have been numerous NGOs, including my own, who have been part of the process of educating the American public about what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories by Israel. So in a sense, this proposed bill is itself an example of foreign influence in that it is a bill that is being pushed for the sole and exclusive purpose of benefiting a foreign state, Israel, by the state of Israel and its allies and friends and supporters here in the United States. Obviously, it's no news to anyone that Israel and its supporters have very, very strong financial influence with elected officials. And the way that they are now choosing to use that muscle is not only to elect officials who support Israel or get officials who are critical of Israel removed from office, but actually to legislate silencing Americans. We saw that with the anti-boycott bills that were also driven to silence efforts to advocate for boycotts of Israel. And now this is even a broader reach. So it is an example of foreign influence. And in a sense, it's the mirror image of the disinformation campaigns of foreign governments, in that on the one hand, they want to pump disinformation to the American public. On the other hand, they want to make sure that they can control the information that the American public receives by shutting down organizations whose viewpoints they don't like. And, as I try to tell people, even if you don't care about Palestine or Israel one little bit, you should care a lot about this legislation, because as usual, it is and will be the Trojan horse that various other interests that want to silence Americans on numerous issues are going to jump on in order to, get NGOs to lose their status based on arbitrary subjective criteria of whose support they can buy in the Treasury.
How concerned are you about this law about losing C3 status? If somebody loses C3 status, they could continue to operate as an LLC or something, but donations would no longer be tax deductible. There'd be other implications. Are you making preparations for this onslaught? Like, what's the how much? Obviously, this public forum, so you probably only share so much. But on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on this?
Well, fortunately at Dawn, I think we're probably not in the top 5 groups that are going to be targeted. The pro-Israel campaigners, malign campaigners who are threatening to dismantle our First Amendment rights, have already very clearly identified a number of groups, including Jewish Voices for Peace, and if not now, but also Students for Justice in Palestine, and a number of other Arab American organizations as their principal targets.
In Project Esther, they specifically refer to those groups as the, quote, Hamas Support Network.
Right.
HSN.
Right. And so certainly, I can imagine that Don will be in the crosshairs because of our aggressive efforts to hold Israeli officials and their aiders and abettors accountable as a matter of law and within, with legal consequences. But I do think it will be devastating to those of us who work in this space, not just because we might lose our C3 status and our supporters may lose their tax deduction for whatever it is they're giving to us. I don't think that will be the determining harm, but rather people will be afraid to give money to us at all because we have been labeled an organization that supports terrorism. Mm-hmm. And that is where not only do you lose supporters, but you probably will lose access to your bank account. The people in this audience know better than anyone what it's like to be sanctioned or to be, to have even the word Iran in the name of an organization. Banks won't touch you. They don't want to transact business with you. Good luck trying to send money somewhere. And so it becomes hard to do business. And you become isolated, and that is the goal. That is absolutely the goal. And my hope is that there will be our independent judiciary will step in as our independent judiciary and hold against whether it's an executive order that Trump issues or a law that actually passes, will find it unconstitutional as an infringement on First Amendment rights and free speech. However, the Supreme Court's decision on the anti-boycott legislation did not reach that conclusion. So it's not a slam dunk that we would win with this Supreme Court in place.
Can you elaborate on that just briefly, the Supreme Court decision you're referring to?
Sure. So as many of you may know, there are probably, I think now 42 states in the United States, state laws that basically allow the state to refuse to do business with a person or a business that advocates for a boycott of Israel. So, for example, and this is a case that went high up in I don't know if it's the case that went to the Supreme Court, but a number of cases went through the federal judicial system. A speech therapist in Texas who worked for the Texas State Educational Board as a speech therapist was dismissed from her job because she refused to sign a contract that says, I will never advocate for a boycott of Israel. And a newspaper in Arkansas, who has nothing to do with the Middle East and doesn't care about the Middle East, lost all of its advertising from the state and the city because it refused to sign a contract with the state saying, we promise never to advocate for a boycott of Israel. And they said, we're never going to promise not to boycott anything. We want to preserve the right to advocate for whatever boycott we want. And a number of appellate courts did validate or on appeal determine that these laws were unconstitutional infringements on speech. However, when the Supreme Court heard this, I think in a very short decision, it basically found that because it wasn't actually, it was a voluntary business that the states were engaging in, they're choosing not to do business with someone who advocates for certain points of view is their prerogative, is their entitlement. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's the decision.
Kombiz, you're fairly well embedded in the nonprofit world.
Yeah.
What kind of concern are you picking up about this particular assault, but also generally how the new government plans to reshape the field?
I mean, it is a little bit unknown exactly what Trump is going to do, but he has promised that he's going to act like an authoritarian. We know there's these plans to go after groups that are critical of Trump for a variety of things. From we did this in 2000 around Black Lives Matter and the protest around George Floyd's killing being sort of labeled terrorism. There's a sort of a McCarthy sort of playbook here, and I think you can trust that even if you have a Supreme Court and that is saying that it's going to, say this is too far. Nonprofit groups and nonprofit groups that we're talking about here are don't have a lot of money to fight this, right? And so you're hoping that 4-5 years down the line, as you're going through this process, even if you've been able to keep your nonprofit status and maybe keep your donors who still give to you, that you're going to come out of this, all the legal fees and everything ahead. And so it's a chilling effect on one side, and then second of all, I'm Iranian American. I came here in 1985. I remember, sorry, bless you. When I first came here, it was I don't know if it's ever been cool to be, Iranian, but I feel like, when Americans discovered Tahdig, we started kind of getting a little bit hip in the mid 2015s, and I don't know where exactly we're at now, but it really feels like going back to the 1980s sort of cultural mentality that because you came from here, that you are a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer, and unless you have these very, extreme points of view about U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, right? We should confront, we should bomb, these kinds of things, that you're not a real sort of American, and it does bother me because it's taken a long time for Iranian Americans to become more politically active, and that chilling effect of sending people back to be I'm just gonna hang out and have coffee and go back into the woodwork is sad, because there are a lot of Iranian Americans who are in politics, doing political work or political campaigns or advocacy, and those voices are essential, to a functioning democracy. And so it does bother me, because just having lived through it once in the 1980s, and then a little bit, or somewhat after September 11th, to see the country sort of going down that playbook in a brand new McCarthyite way is I think distressing, and will be distressing for a lot of groups, who are recruiting, getting donors, and figuring out the issues they're going to take up for the next few years.
And laws like this, Lily, are downstream of both the lobbying, the foreign lobbying that you're talking about, and also culture, which is produced and then regularly reproduced by our media. And I think we witnessed an extraordinary kind of example of that with the coverage of the so-called pogrom in Amsterdam this week. I'm curious, as you kind of watched, because we now live in this strange bifurcated world where we can read and watch. We can read the New York Times and we can watch the mainstream media descriptions of what's happening. But even if we don't live in Amsterdam or weren't in Amsterdam, we can see video reports from citizens or from journalists who are posting everything in real time. And so we can see the difference between those things if we are kind of dedicated consumers of it. Most people are not. But what was it like for you watching that kind of news event unfold?
So before, related to what I just wanted to add to the conversation about the bill today is that it's kind of the third part of this is the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which we're seeing unfold with I also have something sort of allergies, but and the attempt to take that to a legal level where to change the definition of anti-Semitism to include anti-Zionism, which would make the pushback against all of this McCarthyism even harder. And I think, I first heard about what was happening in Amsterdam from
before you get into that, it occurred to me one extra point to add about this Project Esther, which we reported on at Dropside News, which is why it's at the front of my mind. The authors of this report, which are tied into the Heritage Foundation, the Project 2025, went out to try to get a bunch of Jewish groups to sign on,
And they couldn't.
almost all of them
Yeah.
said no. So it's
Even
just a bunch
even
of,
the eight, even I'm not going to say all the Jewish groups in the Jewish establishment are great, especially on this, but
on
yeah,
that they were like, no.
yeah. I mean
So it's a bunch of Christian Zionists.
Project Esther is not the first
Yeah.
and only time where the people actually leading the fight to one, separate Jews and Palestinians and to separate Jews from other minority groups, but to define anti-Semitism in a certain way and to demonize people who are standing in solidarity with Palestinians are not actually Jews themselves, but they're evangelical Christians. The way I heard about what was happening in Amsterdam before seeing any of it on the news was getting messages from family and WhatsApp messages and texts, and it was people saying like, "Oh my God, there's a pogrom," 1938, like freaking out. I mean, really mass. And it was this weekend. I feel like whenever it happened, I think I decided to take Saturday and Sunday like a little bit offline after Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, just for my sanity. So I wasn't seeing the news at all, and I was just getting these messages, and I had to kind of put my phone down because I was like, I first of all can't, and I don't know how much of what my community is saying is the truth. There is, so that is very much how it was interpreted in in a lot of the Jewish world, and at least in the circles that I am a part of. And I think it really speaks to, and then, we've seen how different narratives have come out over the last few days and like the reality and the timeline of what actually happened and how it unfolded. And how, if anything, it's clear that there was like, some hooliganry on, not to both sides this, but it was hooligans and hooligans and hooligans instigating and, the Israeli fans being like incredibly disrespectful in the stadium. But the way that was able to take hold of the media narrative and also to just like run through the Jewish community and play on the very real fear and trauma that still exists for us is, to me, just another example of how, like, one, how deep that is, and two, how real it still is, because the state of Israel and the premise that it has built on has actually failed to make Jews safe, to solve anti-Semitism, to guarantee us like the feeling of security from annihilation that it promised and promises that it would do. And that, I mean, that really, like, the Jewish community has bought into this narrative that like our safety can or even will come at the expense of Palestinian freedom. And the root of that, I mean, of all the things that I was like told about Israel growing up, I think the thing that is the most important ultimately, and what drives most people's support for the state of Israel, regardless of how much they know or choose to not know about the reality of what it means for Palestinians, is the idea that because we have Israel, we will never face something like the Holocaust again. Like that is the guarantee, the promise that we are told, and that the horror of the Holocaust plus the thousands of years of anti-Semitism plus the reality of anti-Semitism today makes all of that, it's like this, this horrible sort of agreement we have to buy into as a community, that we have to be okay with whatever happens to the Palestinians because we have to pick ourselves. And who ultimately benefits from this is clearly not Jews and Jewish people, and even, not to sort of take away their own culpability in it, but like ultimately not Israelis themselves either. And I think, we're seeing the way that the push to silence and demonize any expression of solidarity with Palestinians, even when it is coming from Jewish people, is really championed by white supremacists and Christian Zionists, and of course, and the Jewish community buys into it. That is not like I'm not abdicating the mainstream Jewish community from responsibility at all. But if you look at even AIPAC, the managing director is a Christian Zionist. It is not an inherently Jewish organization, and I think that that's like, unfortunately, something that my community needs to really confront and get really clear-eyed on.
Did anybody else want to?
Yeah, I want to
put any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a this issue of speech and Israel is an unprecedented assault on speech, combined with a massive disinformation campaign. And I think what makes it unique from prior instances of disinformation and censorship is that it's global. What we're seeing now is really twofold. One is a very, very strict campaign to shut down actual information and reporting coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories. It's still stunning to me that there is not one international journalist on the ground in Gaza. And I really don't understand how nobody's broken through, really. I mean, all the journalists in the world. So you have a complete shutdown of actual truth and knowledge and information as much as possible. You have the literal gunning down of over 100 Palestinian journalists in order, again, to silence. And you now have a massive operation targeting countries where free speech exists. So let's say primarily Western Europe and the United States, since the start of the Gaza war, to prohibit protests against the Gaza war and critical of Israel, which a number of countries in Europe have already done. And now you can be sure the outcome of what happened on this Amsterdam soccer game will be further bannings of protests. We have legislation, again, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, that attempts to censor and silence pro-Palestine advocacy. You literally have an effort to prohibit articles of clothing as somehow signaling anti-Semitism. Any representation of Palestinian identity, any representation of Palestinian culture, even a symbol like a watermelon is being prohibited. And I don't know of another example when there has been such a global and globally effective campaign to silence speech. It goes well beyond anything McCarthyism, which was just at least the United States. How is this possible? At the same time, I do think we have to see what happened in Amsterdam as a very well organized campaign of disinformation. I mean, within hours of the assault on these Israeli provocateurs who were clearly trying to invite anger towards them by chanting in circles of people, thousands and thousands of people, death to Arabs, we're going to kill them more, there's no more school children left in Gaza because we killed them all, et cetera, et cetera. And converting that into instantaneously, within hours, nearly every Western elected official and their cousin and their brother telling us this was a pogrom in Amsterdam and it was Kristallnacht. I mean, that is, I'm sorry, very clearly not a coincidence, an organized disinformation campaign. And it reflects the similarity and identity of what our Western elected officials were communicating on cue within hours. You know, is it just random? Did they all just decide all of a sudden to literally express the exact same thing with the exact same words of pogrom and Kristallnacht? It's, you know, it appears to be, I would say, a pretty well coordinated disinformation campaign. And so this is where I see disinformation and censorship working hand in hand at a scale, at a global scale, that I certainly never seen before.
Yeah, it goes to Lily's point where for Israelis and their supporters, the level of atrocities carried out against Palestinians is dependent on the need for Jewish safety in Israel. Like, so the more fear there is outside of Israel, then the more support there is for, you know what, do whatever you need to do. And so like, that is produced by then, like, oh, look, there was this pogrom in Amsterdam. So then that reinforces the Israeli government argument.
Jews aren't safe in the diaspora.
Right.
I hear that, and I understand that that is sort of a mentality of many people in the Jewish community. But like the Holocaust, there's nothing unique about it. there's nothing unique about your culture or your tribe or your identity feeling like you're facing existential risks, existential survival, and justifying horrible, horrible things in the name of that. And, I always seek to de-exceptionalize what is always presented as the exceptional psychology of Jews, the exceptional fear they feel of extermination, the exceptional Holocaust that they suffered. Well, guess what? I'm Armenian. We suffered a genocide. We lost 75% of our population. We do too feel that our existence is threatened from survival surrounded by Azerbaijan and Turkey. We too have suffered ethnic displacement, but we're not seeking to justify a genocide against anyone else. But I think that genocide mentality that gets into people's heads is, of course, based on psychology of exploiting fear. Nothing unique about it to Jews. Not at all. That's my view.
Ben, Jared Kushner, when we talk about Jared Kushner in Saudi Arabia, within days of his departure from the first Trump administration, he was cashing a check for $2 billion with a B from the government of Saudi Arabia for a private equity firm that, as far as I understand it, has yet to make any investments or turn any profits or do anything other than pay himself and others. How does, and Sarah, as a follow-up to this, how did Saudi Arabia pull off going from a so-called pariah, according to Joe Biden in a Democratic debate in 2019, to undergoing apparently no changes and being completely back in the good graces of the U.S. government, both, no matter who the party is?
I think you hit on it with the first $2 billion. And that was just a fraction of what Saudi Arabia has used post Khashoggi to, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, literally buy back its status in the West. And we've seen these massive, we've seen the $2 billion to Kushner. We've seen more and more billions just pouring in from the public investment fund across a number of different sectors. The gaming sector, Hollywood, arts, museums, charitable contributions. I've spent years analyzing the Saudi lobby, as I call it, their PR and lobbying machine here in the U.S. But that is really just the tip of the iceberg to what they've been doing post Khashoggi to buy back their influence. They went, I called it from going from K Street in Washington, D.C., the popular lobbying haven. They went from K Street to Main Street. They started lobbying across America. They started investing across America. And the public investment fund was a big part of that with these economic investments. But we're, of course, seeing it in sports, too. The Live Golf Tour, that DP World Tour, the PGA merger, that made a lot of headline news. But that was also just the tip of the sports washing iceberg. Just about any sport you can think of, soccer, boxing, mixed martial arts, go on and on. I live in Florida now. They're investing in surfing even in Saudi Arabia. It's pretty unbelievable how far they've gone. And what all of this has done together, what I encourage people to do, and I testified before the Senate on this about the Public Investment Fund, don't think of any one thing Saudi Arabia does in terms of garnering influence in the U.S. Don't think of that as an island. It's not. They have an influence ecosystem that is fueled by billions and billions of dollars, and they have effectively bought back all of the influence that they lost post Khashoggi.
Yeah, what's it been? It was probably disorienting for a while to have people actually care about the things you've been saying about Saudi Arabia's behavior for so long. When did you notice them stopping to care? Well, then where are things now?
I think that we haven't around the world fully analyzed why the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the founder of my organization, attracted as much global outrage and sympathy as it did. I think there's still sociologists and anthropologists will have to better analyze that. I think part of it has to do with the Saudis' own bumbling, humiliating, stupid handling of the murder. I mean, literally having someone dress up like Jamal and exit the consulate. It was like a TV show, like a series. What are they going to do today? Oh, the cameras are not working anywhere in the embassy. Oh, what are they going to do today? Oh, they buried his body. They burned his body in the barbecue oven. I mean, it was just, they kept feeding us new and new and new idiocy that kept the world glued. And so made them the object of global ridicule and scorn as it did. I think that what has happened now and where I see such a danger, and there's a word in Arabic called yastahalu. I understand a lot of people in the Middle East use this, but basically what the United States has been doing in many, many parts of the world for probably centuries at this point, which is buying influence, using their financial power to influence and control foreign governments. Not just the United States, the Bank of Britain, and all of the regimes that they controlled even after decolonization through the power of the purse. Saudi Arabia has now learned it can do to us. When it has over 500 former American and military officials who are now on the Saudi government's payroll, earning monies. The Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, gets $1 billion from the Saudi government, not even months after leaving office. It's magic. They've learned how they can do what the United States has been doing to, banana republics all over the world. And they know that they can buy decision-making with respect to Saudi Arabia through the promise of future lavish careers and salaries that they never even imagined. Even the American defense industry, Raytheon and GM, they can't compete with what Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain and Qatar are paying US officials, securing their future, livelihood in perpetuity in a way we've never seen before. And what my organization's working on, because we've realized we can't reform US foreign policy in the Middle East until we end the legalized corruption in our own country. We can't compete against $1 billion paycheck to a former cabinet minister of the US government with our arguments about why it's not a good idea to give an unhinged dictator psycho in Saudi Arabia a security agreement. It's not an argument on the merits. But there's no law in the United States that says that one day after leaving office, you can't get a $1 billion investment from the country that you were making policy decisions about.
I think that's the key, that everything that Sarah described just there and I described, it's all perfectly legal. This is a perfectly legal system of corruption that, exactly as Sarah said, has allowed the Saudi regime to basically run roughshod over U.S. foreign policy, to go from pariah to security pact in 5 years.
Yeah, and just to underscore it, so if you are a U.S. government official now, and you do something either privately, with regard to a memo that is circulated, or you decline to approve a weapons sale, or you decline to set the right time for the meeting that's been requested, correct me if I'm wrong, it is now known to all of those, and Lily, I'm curious if this even has penetrated the Department of Interior. It's now known to those government officials that you have just kind of scratched off Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they operate, collectively, as potential future sources of
investors.
And employment isn't even the right word, because you don't necessarily even have to do anything. That's which I think was one thing that makes these quote unquote jobs so attractive to people, that all you have to do is have done things previously. And then they're going to pay you, and you show up and you speak somewhere, maybe.
And then you can show back again, like Jared Kushner and Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin. But I really want to emphasize, this is not a Republican problem. This is a problem of Republican and Democrats, and that's why, Secretary Blinken, if you're watching this, will you please promise to the American people that you and any future company in your existing advisory firms that you're setting up or exist or have set up that was purchased by Tenyo, you will not accept 1 cent of Saudi Public Investment Fund money. Jake Sullivan, please promise to the American people that you will not accept any job, any investment, any partnership with any foreign government at least 3 years from leaving office. I'm not hearing anything. I've even had Democratic members of Congress, when I've challenged them to make this promise, to say, well, you know, it's in the American interest for me to go and work as a consultant for the UAE, because that way I can ensure that they keep buying US weapons. I'm doing the American people a favor when I cash in and go and work for the Emiratis. So this is not a Republican problem. They've just figured out a way to make more money doing it. But, you know, like I said, I'm still waiting for Secretary Blinken to tell us who his clients were at West Exec Advisors and whether it included Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Still no answer. And the term is up. Can you tell us now? You're finished. Tell us. Still waiting.
I also think part of the problem is Republicans don't pretend to care about human rights. And Democrats do. And I think we're seeing, you know, in all of the takes, which, like, you know, I don't think anyone has a real analysis yet, any one person or any one thing of why the Democrats lost on Tuesday. But, you know, you can't, like, people do not buy hypocrisy in the same way that they do anymore. And you know, across, like, the American electorate, people believe that politicians lie because they do. And at least I think what I have seen, and, you know, and even just from seeing, I was on the ground in Pennsylvania before the election, not with the Democrats, but, you know, knocking doors with the union. And I think people have this sense of, like, all of these politicians are going to lie to me. So at least I'd rather go with the one who, like, I know half of what they say is going to be BS, you know, but I think they're being more authentic. And Democrats kind of, you know, we do this thing where, oh, this is good for us, like, this is, you know, but we care about international human rights and sort of liberal humanist ideas, but then in the reality, their behavior is basically the same.
This is the Menendez, where you know, on his face it's human rights, but behind closed doors it's looking up the value of gold bars that he just
right, yeah.
I mean, for Menendez, just in case folks haven't been following, you know, there's the legalized corruption of taking a $1 billion paycheck weeks after leaving office, like the Secretary of Treasury. And then there's the Dumbo way of corruption by the Dumbos in Egypt, who literally handed gold bars to Senator Menendez, the chairman of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, the biggest nuclear power, economic power in the world, and he hid these gold bars in his closet in his house, right? So that's the illegal corruption for which he has been found guilty, and he finally resigned, and hopefully he'll be going to jail fairly soon. But has the State Department, has the FBI conducted an investigation of every Egyptian communication with every member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Was it really just Menendez? No. Have they put Egypt on some kind of a blacklist saying, you just corrupted the head of our Senate Foreign Relations Committee? How dare you? Not another dime to Egypt. Nope. Secretary Blinken was yet again sitting praising General Sisi for being such a great mediator because, you know, he ended the war in Gaza, done such a great job. Thank you, General Sisi, for your fantastic work. Here's a new $1.6 billion. I mean, where is the follow-up? Where's the investigation? Nothing.
And this gets to the heart of the hypocrisy of the U.S. response to disinformation and to malign foreign influence campaigns. You go down the list: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey. Think of the Mayor Adams case.
Azerbaijan, Quayar, also indicted, also about
all of these countries were willing to punish the pawns, never do a thing to the countries. Israel, you know, going back to Israel, front page of the New York Times, multiple other media outlets, where articles that look like an indictment about illicit foreign influence operations in the U.S. What's the Justice Department say? To this day, I've just been waiting for it. Not a word. We have multiple foreign influence indictments since then, and yet not a word about something that's on the front page of the New York Times. So there's two systems of justice in the U.S. when it comes to foreign influence. There's one for America's friends. There's another for its enemies. And America's friends are getting away with everything with impunity.
And for its enemies, Kombiz, the State Department funding of the project, we wrote about this over at The Intercept, called Iran Disinfo.
Yeah.
Which came after NIAC, among other other
Absolutely.
entities?
Iran Disinfo, and you guys did an amazing job
Yeah.
covering this, was a program in the Trump State Department. The State Department for decades has always sort of funded and supported, dissident groups, satellite TV stations into Iran or other sort of countries, that kind of work. And they had a unit inside, a group inside that was being paid for by the State Department that was set up to push back against disinformation that comes from online from the IRGC, and that was the idea behind it. Except, this group was paying Twitter writers and other people to go after American citizens of Iranian descent, go after NIAC, go after other groups, essentially calling them, pawns of the regime itself, right? Which is, like it is. You could be a pawn of, another country, and that's okay. But I will tell you, as somebody who is, an American citizen who's of Iranian descent, like, you are aware that, like, you do not, you don't want to accidentally deal with somebody who is an Iranian who works for the IRGC. You're not going to, I do not work in foreign policy because, like, education is so much more peaceful, and you don't have to, it's against the law to do, be involved in any way with Iran. And so that was reported by you guys. It ended up getting shut down. Subsequent reporting at The Intercept showed that, these people were supposed to go into Richard Grenell's replies and defend him, as this was part of their sort of job against any criticism about the Trump administration or what he was doing. And so it was a real sort of moment of like, oh, this is the, we rightly called out Russia for the disinformation effort in 2016, but we're starting to see it sort of turn, like people realizing like, oh, we could use disinformation against ourselves. And one of the things that, one of the things in 2022, after the killing of Mahsa Amini in Iran, you see this huge movement taking to the streets. And, I've been following Iran all my life since I've come here. This was in 1999. I was sort of glued to internet radio. 2003, it was internet radio and blogs. 2009, I have lived through these protests and trying to figure out how do we get the word out about what people are saying, what they're doing. People who are being arrested, like putting some pressure on the government to get these people out. And what I started seeing immediately afterwards was this giant sort of effort using the protests to target Iranian Americans. Now we're talking journalists at the New York Times, journalists at Politico, think tankers, people at NIAC, independent journalists, sort of really sort of going after them in sort of the most derogatory way. 2/3 of it was in Persian and not in English, but it was still, large enough that, there were days where, somebody was getting 160,000 mentions on Twitter itself, which at that point means that your name is, on a trending topic on there. And because of that, I started, I do this in the domestic political world, right? Like there's a lot of disinformation, targeting educators, targeting LGBTQ youth that we've sort of seen in the last few years, and taking some of those tools and just starting to measure what was sort of going on. 160,000, mentions from, a regular week before that was like 50 mentions, is kind of shocking. So start figuring out, like, what are these accounts? And you start seeing, thousands of accounts with 0 followers that all they do is, retweet content, amplifying sort of these, like crazy sort of fringe Iranian voices, or, people at, think tanks in the United States who are very pro-war against Iran. And you start seeing this sort of building up, and you're like, what the heck is going on? And your initial take is you're Iranian, and you're like, oh, this is probably like the IRGC, like using this moment to like divide community. And then you see, Saudi-funded television channels for Iran, Iran International, that are like part of this sort of effort, right? Like there is a BBC presenter who the IRGC released her talking to her mom about the protests in Iran. So they, tapped her line and recorded it. And these, these sort of mobs online and Iran International like take off with, with these accusations that she is dismissing the protests that are happening in Iran. It's actually like like the IRGC, used it to their benefit, and then Saudi intelligence or whoever else used it to their benefit, and then these Twitter followers, we're talking thousands of them, just sort of amplifying it, and in the real world, it turns into death threats, it turns into bomb threats. That she has left the BBC. There are other people who've just sort of gone offline who are, targets of this disinformation effort. And, for me, I've collected, millions of tweets from, this sort of network. I've, mapped it out at like 15,000. The vast majority of it, 60+% of it is gone now. But, some of the, there are parts of it that are still around that you will see that are, Iranians, who are very, pro-Israel, like, demolishing Gaza, who are, when, Israel has launched weapons at Iran, are like cheering it on, which is like that is not something you're going to really get from the Iranian American community. And we know that, we can talk about that afterwards, but we know that because of, some conversations and some work we've done before the election. And, I have, shared this data and whatever, this data with, people, because it seems like it's the Russian disinformation, but it's targeted at American citizens who are doing political work here. And it's one of these things where, if the Russians are doing it, if Iran is doing it, the Justice Department, whoever else, is very upfront about like, this is happening, correctly, and pointing it out and whatever else. But with this effort, nothing. I mean, it did at some point after being turned over to, authorities, it did sort of die down. But you think like, oh, was it the Saudi government? Was it, now we've seen some of this happen in the news around Gaza, where, it went after members of Congress here at this disinformation network. We've seen it in, the New York Times reported that the Israeli government is having, people amplify attacks against American, lawmakers. As part of this effort to sort of try to win the war about what's going on in Gaza, in the media war here. And so there's like this question of like, is there two standards here? Like I do political work, and sometimes, I've done and won campaigns and been like very proud of the work. It is a difficult thing to move public opinion. But it is even much more difficult to move public opinion when, you've got a state that is invested on the other side, on a political issue. And if we're not, we should be calling it out with, Russia. We should be calling it out with Iran and any other countries that are doing it. But if we have allies that are doing it, are we sort of, nonchalantly like, have we heard what's going on with, Israel's efforts to go after members of Congress that we read in the New York Times? I've talked to reporters about what happened to the Iranian community. Lots of reporters were aware of it. Were like sources, people they talk to, people they know, were being threatened. So very, very aware of it. And they're like, oh yeah, it's probably the Saudis. It's probably like this. But there's no, there's been sort of no ability. Like there's no going and unearthing it. And so it really struck at me as a, as an Iranian American in 2015. I mean, the political power of this is that 2015, when we had the JCPOA, and the Republicans and Bibi tried to stop it, the vast majority of Iranian Americans or, Iran analysts were going on TV saying like, yeah, this is a really good deal. Like, look, it takes war around nuclear weapons off the table. and it stops Iran from getting nuclear weapons in a verifiable way. Like this is good, and then you can focus on human rights issues and other issues that we should be focusing on. We shouldn't be constantly on the verge of war with Iran. That's not what Americans want. And the vast majority of those commentators who were, Iranian American were very much like, yeah, this is a good deal. Like even though we dislike this regime, this is an important step to take. Let's take the war off so that we can push for other things. And it really does feel like it's an effort to marginalize those voices. If you're Iranian American, you're like the last thing you want to be called, or the last thing you want to, it's an insult to be called, like you're doing the regime's work as they're hanging people, and it's very ugly. And so what it does is it creates room for these other, your Chalobis that exist inside the diaspora. To be like, oh no, these are actually the voices, and you're starting to see some of that happening now with like the people who get on TV who are like, you've never heard of them before. They're Iranian, and they are they're cheering Israel bombing Iran, which I mean nobody in the community does. It's not a thing.
And to wrap this up, curious for people's thoughts on what ought to be happening when it comes to foreign influence. My own kind of controversial, jaded, cynical take after many years of covering this is that there's actually an argument that gets overlooked for just opening the floodgates of foreign influence into the United States for America's national interest, in the sense that as the American government is trying to make foreign policy decisions in its interests, it has, by sanctioning particular countries, whether it's Russia or Iran or whatever, it has kind of shut out their ability to lobby on behalf of their interests, but it has enhanced and allowed their opponents or people who are completely unrelated to them to lobby on behalf of their interests. And so they have tipped the scales of the debate in Washington, and so they're going to produce shaded results from that process, which are not necessarily going to be in American national interests. And so if you can't kind of get your foreign influence under control, you might as well just let everybody in so that you can hear from everybody before you make whatever decision you're going to make, because it's going to impact them. So as you guys have been part of this and watched this unfold, what is the effect on kind of quote unquote American national interest?
I think there's actually a great case study, to your point, that was inadvertently conducted after Russia invaded Ukraine. One of the biggest outcomes of that, in terms of everything the U.S. did, the U.S. response, the world's response, one of the biggest things that the U.S. did was when they issued sanctions, they cut Russia off from K Street.
Mm-hmm.
K Street had a big lobbying and influence operation built up prior to the war in Ukraine, prior to the invasion. And it was going toe to toe with an also pretty well funded Ukrainian lobby. And,
Mm-hmm.
they were sort of, they were doing what you were saying. They were having
Right.
that lobbying fight. Everybody's voices was being heard. Ukraine war happens. Their sanctions come in. The sort of Russian influence gets absolutely eliminated. All the other stuff we talked about. People being accused of Russian mouthpieces. That sort of thing. And so then you have that Ukraine lobby is the voice. And some folks have said, sort of exactly to your point, Ryan, that could potentially have been at least part of the impediment to getting to a diplomatic solution to this, because there's Russian representatives. They're gone.
Mm-hmm.
They're totally cut off from K Street now. And so whether that's true or not, that has impeded a ceasefire, impeded a deal, it's a fair question. But to your point, it is. I do think it is valuable to have those voices. What we've seen historically in the foreign influence industry, a majority of the countries in the world have right now registered foreign agents working on their behalf in America. But there is just absolutely enormous, incredible inequality in who gets, even amongst those countries who are all invited in. It's, whoever has the most money gets the most lobbyists. And so you see, the outside voices from the Saudi lobby, which we've mentioned, the Emiratis, the Qataris, and others. And so you don't see, where you particularly see this is in humanitarian catastrophes, Western Sahara, Sudan, countries that are facing Yemen, countries that are facing just really human rights calamities. They're often not at the table, even though, they would be welcome to, hire lobbying PR firms. They can't afford to. And so it's the countries that surrounding them, the powerful countries, that are gaining that influence over them anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? How do you fix this?
I mean, you can chip away at the problems, and the specific angle that we're focusing on at Dawn is legislation that will prohibit U.S. officials from doing business with foreign governments for at least 3 years after leaving office. And by the way, Biden did sign into law the exact same principle that only applies to intelligence agents. So if you work for one of the U.S. intelligence agencies, you are now prohibited from working or doing business with a foreign government for at least 3 years after leaving office. And the reason why our government rushed in to pass that law was because we had American CIA officials going and cashing in with the Emiratis, who then use that spycraft to turn around and spy on Americans. But the tip of the iceberg is the spooks, right? We need the actual legislators to be subject to that ban. But it's a much bigger problem about money in politics. And we are not going to rehash Citizens United and the 1,000,001 ways in which our government is controlled either by domestic oligarchies or now increasingly foreign ones. People in the Middle East all joke all the time saying they should get to vote in American elections too. And maybe the American election should be a global election, that everyone gets some kind of vote in, given that they are their lives are impacted more than many Americans. I mean,
they should get representatives in the House.
I mean, look at the, look at
DC doesn't even have that.
2 million people in Gaza. They are their entire existence, their life, their right to exist, their right to survive as human beings is determined by people sitting in Congress. Right
in
now.
principle, I don't think it's absurd at all. Like following Central and South America's response to the election of Trump, like the appointees that he's running through at this point are like, forget about the rest of the world when it comes to Central and South America as hawkish and as interventionist as possible. So things are going to change significantly for tens of millions of people who had no say in that change. So they're just on a principled level, it is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
So that's all the time we have, though. Thank you, Kombiz, Lily, Sarah, Ben, and thank you, everybody here, for inviting us and allowing us to do this.
Let's hear it for him, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.